Hello, everybody. The webinar will begin very shortly. We'll just take a few moments while everybody joins the call. So, hello from London, where I am based, and welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to be talking about how to tackle the most common threats facing the Canadian government. We're talking about cyber threats in particular. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which works with civil servants in Canada, the UK, and all around the world. And I'd also like to thank our knowledge partner for today, which is Google Cloud. So, in terms of today's topic, tackling those common threats facing the Canadian government, it's true to say that cybersecurity threats faced by governments, they're always evolving, always changing, with criminals and bad actors constantly trying to exploit vulnerabilities in government to compromise how services are delivered. And across the world, governments are working to understand the landscape of the threats, how they're changing, what they're facing, and understanding what works best in terms of the mitigation measures that they can put in place to be able to respond to those threats. So in today's webinar, we will be sharing insights from experts on how government organisations can understand and address the cyber threats that they are facing. We have four fantastic panelists with us here today. In a moment, I will introduce our panelists, and then we're going to get into a bit of a conversation. I've got a few questions to put to our speakers, but actually, we want this webinar to be as interactive as possible with you, our audience. So we're going to allow lots of time for questions from the audience. So on whichever device you are using, you should see somewhere on your screen, there's a Q&A button. Please use that Q&A button at any time. So from now on, don't wait till the end. From now on, message in any questions or comments that you have. If somebody's speaking and you have a question or a comment for the speaker, please message that question in and we'll get through as many of those as we can by the end of our webinar. So in terms of our great speakers today, we have Eric Sauvé, who is Chief Information Officer at the Canada Council for Arts. And Eric brings over 20 years of senior digital leadership experience in both the public and private sectors. He's led the development of digital and security strategies, as well as the delivery of major transformational initiatives. He's trained in cybersecurity, enterprise architecture, product management, agile process, and business administration. Then we will also be hearing from Justin Lafontaine, who is Director of Technology Analysis at the Office of the Privy Commissioner of Canada. And since joining the Government of Canada in 2004, Justin has held numerous positions in the field of cybersecurity across a number of federal departments and agencies. And he's now leading a team of cybersecurity experts supporting the Office of the Privy Commissioner in fulfilling its core mandate regarding compliance and promotion activities related to privacy legislation and best practices. And then we have two colleagues from our knowledge partner, Google Cloud. So we've got Jessie Jordan, who has over 20 years of cyber experience and is currently the Mandiant Canada Deputy Lead for Cybersecurity at the Google office located in Toronto. And Jessie also leads the Mandiant Global Virtual CISO program and regularly oversees and delivers security program assessments, cyber response readiness assessments, cyber due diligence and security program development for organisations and governments in Canada, the United States and other countries around the world. And then last but by no means least, we've got Alicia Hoy, who is Principal Consultant for Mandiant Canada, also at Google Cloud. Alicia has over 7 years of experience working with clients in a broad range of industries, including the public sector, and she assists organisations with incident response readiness and cybersecurity risk reduction, ranging from the development of cybersecurity programs and transformation initiatives to identifying threat-driven security recommendations tailored for a specific facet of the organisation. So I'm sure you'll agree with me. We have a fantastic panel here for real experts on these issues. Please do, as I say, use this opportunity to message in your questions to really pick their brains and use that Q&A function at any point from now on. So I'm going to begin the conversation. I think, Eric, I'm going to come to you first. I think just by setting the scene, really, I guess the obvious question to start with from the perspective of the Council, Canada Council for the Arts, is how well does your organisation understand the nature and the scale of the cyber threats that it might be facing at the moment?
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and hopefully for our attendees, I can add a little bit of value and perspective to the work that you're undertaking. So at the Canada Council, I think very similar to to other Government of Canada organizations, there's a number of kind of potential threat actors and different kind of movements of threats that we see on the landscape. And it can often be difficult to keep up with them. I mean, even as we were kind of waiting for this call to start, we're talking about, different activities that are happening in different geographic regions of the world. And even in some cases, even though it may happen in peer organizations, we aren't always aware of exactly what is happening when a threat does happen. So I think, it's important to recognize that, while there's a lot of stuff going on, the way I understand our kind of threat landscape is that even though we may not always know, this new group or this government actor, these sorts of things. Well, we may not know kind of the high level perspective on the movements of those threat actors. What we do know, I think quite well, are the tactics that they typically use. And so the way I try and think of the threat landscape is a little bit less around the players and a little bit more
Mm,
around what are the main strategies that they would pursue. And I think in those cases, I think we know quite a bit about what the main threat actors would do. Um, in the Government of Canada, there's quite a few kind of frameworks that we use and leverage. I think that do a pretty good job at codifying, the main threat vectors or defenses against the main threat vectors. We also do a number of internal assessments. So there's a few pieces of guidance, that I think are really interesting. There's one that's the Target Security Operating Model, which is something that we use quite often here at the Canada Council, I think, which is really interesting and good. Of course, we have kind of the more standard cloud guardrails and that sort of thing that we're
mhm,
implementing. But we also go to kind of internal assessments or third-party assessments that maybe use different frameworks to assess what we're doing. And really, what that does is it tries to look at the different threats in different ways and then see how they apply to our situation. And of course, one of the most important ways to understand the threat environment is through up-to-date vulnerability management. So if we know that there's an emerging threat, we're tracking that in our different systems,
mhm.
and we're getting alerts from the Canadian Cyber Center. So those are, threats that are emergent that are kind of right now. Um, so that's kind of how we do it. I mean, you kind of go from this broad landscape
Mhm.
that might seem a little bit hard to keep up on and hard to understand. But I think what we do understand is really the tactics that they would normally take, the threat
Yeah.
tactics that they would normally take. And so this is where I feel like there is an opportunity for an organization to feel fairly on top of it as a result of looking at it that way.
Brilliant. Thanks, Eric. Nice way to kick us off there. So as you're saying, I think that will probably resonate with a lot of people that it's probably quite difficult to keep up with all of the different kind of players, all of the different bad actors. But as you say, you can understand maybe the tactics and the strategies that are being used. Maybe when we come on to a bit more of a discussion, we can talk about the nature of those and how they're changing, maybe some of those tactics as well. But you also mentioned there, which people might have questions about, some of the frameworks and the guidance that exist, which help different organizations across the public sector to help them to understand the nature of those threats and how they should be responding to them. Thanks so much, Eric. And off the back of that, Justin, I can see you nodding. I'm going to come to you for the same question, really. In the Office of the Privy Commissioner, how well would you say the office understands the kind of nature and scale of the cyber threats that it's facing?
So first off, thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's a pleasure. So it's a great question. So the Office of the Privacy Commissioner is actually uniquely positioned, right? We're a regulator that's there to enforce the Privacy Act, which stipulates how federal government departments should be handling privacy matters, and then also pivot up how the private sector should be handling personal information. So when a breach happens that involves the personal information of Canadians, there's a mandatory requirement for that breach to be reported back to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. So in a sense, we're getting to see like in real time what everyone else is seeing, the kind of like threat actors that are hitting them, the attack vectors that are being used. So that gives us like a unique vantage point as to how we can protect our own systems, right? We have a lot of personal information on Canadians because obviously Canadians are reporting breaches to us. So personal privacy is of the utmost priority for us. How do we go about doing that? So obviously there's a continuous monitoring for vulnerabilities, perpetual scanning. We also do some limited red teaming exercise. The challenge there though is that it's resource intensive. So we have to figure out like where's going to be like, the big bang for the buck, so to speak. Also, like Eric mentioned, the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity has like great information, produce great advisories. We also complement that with other external sources. So a good example would be the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency for the United States. They also publish their own advisories. Sometimes it's duplicative or it's complementary to what the Cyber Center does. But again, it's another great source of threat intelligence. But again, I think like Eric mentioned, focusing on the TTPs as opposed to the threat actors is probably the right way for departments to protect themselves against emerging threats.
Thanks, Justin. So as you say, interesting to hear, you cover both the public and the private sector in terms of
Correct.
the issues. So you get an overview of kind of where the breaches are happening across both of those.
That's correct.
Thanks. And
Both from
Justin,
like the large scale departments to the big companies, all
yeah.
the way down to like the mom and pop shops that
Yeah.
suffered a breach.
Yeah. So you can see quite quickly then if things are changing where new
Absolutely.
threats are occurring. And so you have quite a good amount of data there. And just I know in the audience we have quite a few people who are kind of specialists in this area who will be dealing with it, but we have some maybe who are more from maybe the policy profession. So this isn't necessarily their kind of day-to-day specialism. Could you just use, you mentioned their red teaming exercise. Could you just
Yes.
a little bit more about what that is?
So imagine it's pretty much like a team of cybersecurity experts, and they're going to put on like the bad guy hat, and they're going to try and penetrate the system. The scope of that varies on the engagement per se, but again, they're pretending to be the bad guys, trying to find vulnerabilities and exploit them before the actual bad people do it.
Brilliant. And we're going to move on to some of the things you can do to prepare. Maybe we can also talk about those kind of issues when we're coming on to to that question as well. So, Jesse, I'm going to come to you first, and then Alicia, if you want to come in as well afterwards. But Jesse, so you work obviously with lots of different companies across the Canadian public sector and other countries as well. From your experience of working with those numerous bodies, I mean, you've heard what Justin and Eric are saying there about how they think from their organizations, they understand the nature of the threat. How well do you think, in general, public sector bodies are doing when it comes to understanding the scale and the nature of the threats they're facing?
Great question, and thank you very much for having me. Very much appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. I think, some of the most dedicated and skilled people that I've worked with are in the public sector, right? And I think they appreciate the depth of the incident impact that they're responsible for, right? I think the challenges are the same as we see in the private sector. I think resources are stretched thin. I think we see that across really all industries. Nation states, particularly DPRK with their insider threat workers, which we've all been hearing about in the news, I think have really raised a lot of eyebrows in the public and private sector. Using these workers to exfiltrate intellectual property, other sensitive information, I think has really kind of brought to the forefront cybersecurity, and I think that's helping, particularly from a legislative perspective, to move things forward, right? I think from the public sector, I think one of the other challenges we see quite a bit, and this is the same as in any really large organization, is there are silos, right? Information sharing, I think across sectors has improved, but I think can still improve a little bit more, right? I think that there's also an acknowledgement from the public sector that they can learn a lot from the private sector, particularly when it comes to things like artificial intelligence and how AI can be used to enhance cyber defense practices, right? We talk a lot about the negatives of AI, but there are a lot of positives from a defender's advantage perspective. I think, we're also seeing a lot of collaboration on security awareness, cyber defense modernization, intelligence sharing, and also helping define some of those target operating models from a sector interaction perspective. And then, I would close off on this question by saying that, the CCCS, which was mentioned a couple times already, releases the National Cyber Threat Assessment annually. The Ontario government has established a cybersecurity center of excellence to help address cybersecurity challenges in the broader public sector. They share a lot of great information about quantum IoT. They have yearly cybersecurity summits. And then from a legislation perspective, Bill 194 in Ontario was recently introduced into an act, which actually helped to define some of the requirements for public sector institutions from a privacy impact perspective, AI, cyber framework perspective. So these are all helping move things forward, and I think that we're seeing a lot of good progress in the space.
Brilliant, thanks, Jesse. Alicia, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, maybe just another lens here and appreciate the floor. I would say we've talked a lot about, security understanding, and I think that understanding has really increased both in public and private sector. There's always the aspect as well as understanding between security in public sector or private sector and everybody else. So we've seen a lot of the recent attacks are leveraging some form of social engineering, right? Insider threats, so breaking business processes that are actually in place. So how do we as security professionals really look at not only just making sure we have that understanding, but we're actually integrating some of those checks into business processes and actually equipping those frontline workers who are interacting with the public or who may be targeted in more sophisticated attacks to say, okay, well, now how do we make sure they understand the threats that are facing?
Yeah.
But that is through things like Cybersecurity Awareness Month or other security awareness initiatives. But that's equally as important. And I think that's something both public and private sector are struggling with to say, how does security actually share that information and make sure that not just security personnel, but overall organizations understand the threats that they're facing.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm going to come back on lots of what you have said there with some follow-up questions as well. But I do want to go just very quickly. Justin, Charles had a follow-up question for you, which was, do you use external or internal hackers to do the red team exercise?
So first off, I want to clarify something. We don't go, let's say, on Discord or Telegram, say like, hey, any hackers for hire that can do like some red teaming for us. Like, that's not how it happens. First off, like they're government employees or like third-party consultants that we will hire. So to answer the actual question, is it both like internal and external facing? Both.
Okay.
So usually like, we'll start with the external piece. And to see like once we get in, can we do like, some lateral movement? Can we do like, privilege escalation, that kind of stuff? So we try to test both angles. But again, to clarify, and I'll touch a bit on that challenge too, like we want to hire like, experts in cybersecurity to be able to do those kind of assessments. The hiring challenge is present. It's tough to find good cybersecurity personnel to train them up to have like the right skill set. It's
Mm.
difficult. We're competing with like the Mandiants of the world or the Googles of the world to hire that top talent. So again, it's a challenge that I think as the government as a whole, we have to think of like innovative solutions as to how we can bring
Yeah.
the best talent in to do that kind of
Yeah.
assessment.
Yeah, and for all digital, I think that's a really
Yeah.
big challenge facing the public sector. So just going back to what Jesse and Alicia said there, then I think some of the things that you said, Jesse, in particular, that are challenges for the public sector, maybe when it comes to understanding the nature and the scale, is resources always stretched thin across the public sector. So many challenges, such a limited amount of money to be able to meet all of those silos. This is really interesting. Every single thing we do in Global Government Forum, whether it's about transformation, digital, anything, it so often doesn't come down to the technology. It comes down to the siloed nature of the public sector. And as you say, challenges around sharing information and sharing best practice. And then, Alicia, what you were saying there as well about maybe the need for some training so that all kind of officials understand the kind of cyber issues, have a basic level of understanding. So that brings me on nicely, I think, to the second question I wanted to put to all of you, which is there's understanding the nature of the threat, but then there's how do you actually think about preparing for cyber incidents, and how do you maybe both preparing for cyber incidents, but maybe what do you do to try and prevent cyber incidents from happening in the first place? Justin, I'm going to come to you and Eric, and then I'll come back to Alicia and Jesse. So, Justin, in terms of preparing, where do you look for in terms of good practice? Do you kind of learn from each other? What are you doing in the Office of the Privy Commissioner?
So first off, I think like Eric had first mentioned, understanding your attack and threat surface area is important. If you don't know what you have, what your exposure is, you can't protect adequately. With that having been said, we found in the past that doing like tabletop exercises is probably one of the best things. It tests your readiness as an operation, as like an organization. And it's not just thinking of like just the cyber angle, it's also all the other stakeholders within the organization that have to be engaged. For instance, comms, right? So you have like, imagine a breach and then, the threat actor starts posting on Twitter or like X, whatever it is, saying like, by the way, I just compromised like, this organization.
Mm.
It's like, how do you manage that? How do you control the narrative? That's often something that's not thought about. And also like the reality is like breaches will happen. It's not if, it's a question of when. And when you plan your tabletop exercise, always stick with the worst case scenario. Like right now, we're in the process of ourselves, like planning a tabletop exercise for the next year. And like, we were discussing like what should the scenario look like. And some people were like, let's go for something like, in between into severities. Like, no, think of the worst. Think like, the commissioner's on vacation, for instance, like, your CIO is also on vacation, someone just called in sick, and there's also another unrelated outage. Like, think of the
Yeah.
worst case scenario, and that's how you go about doing it. Also, I want to give a little shout out. So recently, like my team, we participated in the IBM Cyber Range exercise. So it's at the University of Ottawa. Fantastic training opportunity. It's literally a tabletop exercise that's in a simulated environment. Highly recommended for those of you that are interested. And
Justin, would we be able to share afterwards, maybe with people who registered, share some information on that? Because I think people would be really interested in that.
Absolutely. I'll share it in the general chat.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Sorry, I cut you off there, Justin. Were you finished with your...
I was finished. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Justin. So, Eric, similarly, coming to you, would there be similar things that you'd be doing in the Council for the Arts as to what Justin said there in terms of preparedness for incidents?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. Maybe what I'll do is I'll share a little bit some of the best practices that we've kind of come up with in terms of our incident response. So one of the things that we found was really important is that your incident response plan has to be easy to understand. So you can have a scenario where your incident response plan is like a lot of pages. So then there's an incident and then people are trying to read through that, or how does it work, right? So for sure, the tabletop exercise kind of help people practice that.
Yeah.
But, sometimes if there's edge cases in the process or these sorts of things, anyway, so it's good to have something that's easy to understand, easy to communicate. One of the things that we found is important is not just kind of testing the response, but also making sure that the right conditions exist around the response, right? So setting expectations with different teams as to the service level that we anticipate if there is an incident off hours or on the whenever, right? So making sure that resources who are involved in it know the expectation um, for when it happens. Um, One of the things, and this is something that Justin alluded to, is the role of communications in incident response. And I think this is very meaningful for two reasons. One is that it's important for communications to understand what the role is. And if they can have a crisis management plan, great. If they understand how their work connects to the work of the technical teams, wonderful. One of the other pieces that I think is really important is having your incident response plan, making sure to kind of wall off the different teams. Because there's this tendency when there is an incident, unless there's clear lines of communication, that the people who are solving the problem end up doing communications work or responding to inquiries. So this is one of the important parts of the plan, is to be able to kind of isolate the technical folks for them to be able to kind of address the challenges while the communication happens regularly, so people feel informed and people understand what's going on. So those are just a few of the processes that we've had, and of course, practice is the key. It's a key. It's a key piece, and all the different ways, like Justin, like you're mentioning, the different places you can go, like ways to make it kind of fun and interesting and keep people engaged with different scenarios is critical, because you don't know what you're going to face when the situation does arise.
Thanks, Eric. So some very practical kind of good practice there, as you say. Have an incident response plan that's easy to understand. You don't want people having to go through pages and pages of things in the moment. And then I really like what you said, and I will come on to issues around kind of trust and transparency. I think they're really important in terms of maintaining trust with the public in these moments. And what you said there about having that line of kind of connection between comms and tech people and understanding who's supposed to be doing what, I think really, really important. Some of the issues that you've learned lessons from there. Thanks so much, Eric. Good to see we've got other questions coming in, which I will come to in a minute. But Alicia and then Jesse, I wanted to get your thoughts before we go to some questions on this issue of kind of how well the public sector and public sector bodies are prepared for incidents. So you must have seen lots of different organisations and how they prepare. What are your thoughts on how well those bodies are preparing for incidents? Alicia, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at preparedness, just, foundationally, it's really how well are you protecting and what do you know what you're protecting, right? So everything we talked about, controls and framework. We look at monitoring. So how well can you detect if there's any anomalous activity that's actually happening? And then, as we've talked about, how can you actually respond to it? So we talked about a lot of the frameworks that are now available in public sector, a lot of the alignment that's happening. And we're even seeing partnerships between, private companies, public sector, to make sure that they're adhering to those controls. Monitoring is also one where we're seeing a little bit more customization in that monitoring, not just relying on central monitoring capabilities, but also looking to say, like, hey, what's actually valuable for our department, agency, ministry? What type of data do we have? How do we start to actually enhance some of those specialized monitoring areas to make sure that we're actually getting a view that's tailored to our department, agency, ministry? And then incident response preparedness, I think, it's been a long journey. I think we've evolved quite substantially in both public, private, but especially in public, where now there's a lot more coordination across the federal government, as well as the municipal and provincial governments as well, where we're actually saying, okay, well, now we actually figured out how we're going to coordinate more broadly across the government entities, and then as well as within. So I'm seeing a lot more enhancement to say, okay, now that we've got a better understanding of across board, how do we actually make sure that we're uplifting our response capabilities internally? Similar to what the other panelists have mentioned, coordination, communication is also a big one. And then decision authorities is also another one that I wanted to highlight. So understanding who's actually approving to take something offline, who's actually approving the recovery, who's actually approving to disconnect the internet. Some of those decision authorities, especially as it becomes a larger incident, becomes something that's a lot more tricky to figure out, especially if that's something that hasn't been practiced in the past, or in theory was available or around and determined a couple of years ago, but now things have shifted, the structure is different. Now, what does that look like? So I would say overall, because we've seen and we've been part of a number of sector-wide type preparedness tabletops exercises, we're also seeing more enhancements and evolutions, right, in these exercises, and say, okay, we've done some of these foundational ones. How do we make them more tricky? How do we make them more difficult? Some of them are even, hands-on in an organization's environment. So overall, the maturity is increasing, and that's always good to see.
Brilliant, thanks, Leash. So getting some of those foundational things in place, making sure that you've mapped everything, that coordination, as you say, and communication really important. And then, as you say, in advance, understanding what the decision-making authorities would be so that you're not working that through at the time of an incident. So really important, some lessons there. Jesse, anything that you wanted to add from Google Cloud perspective, what you've seen working with public sector bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are frameworks to follow that have been around for a long time, right? We have NIST, we have ISO, we have NERC-CIP for critical infrastructure, others that have already been mentioned. I think the other thing to really highlight is threat intelligence. It's critical to have a good understanding of the threat actors, what their motivations are, and their tactics, their techniques, and their procedures, right? What are they going after? That's how ultimately how we're going to defend against these threat actors.
Yeah.
It is important to have, a good mix of commercial threat intelligence feeds, federal and provincial law enforcement as well, and make sure that those detection use cases are continually updated, as was mentioned. The other thing I think is critical is to make sure that our perimeters are secure. I mean, we've I've been in this industry for 20 years, and we were dealing with firewall vulnerabilities 20 years ago, and they're still happening today, right? Exploits are the number one attack vector, even beyond phishing, in terms of how threat actors are actually getting into environments today. So, the other thing that was, I think, mentioned is, communications, having a plan. I would highly, consider cyber insurance as part of that plan, making sure that, retainers are in place for incident response readiness and support. Breach counsel is considered. Critical decision making is part of these communication plans and crisis response plans in terms of things that the industry is seeing quite a bit, right? So let's consider ransomware and extortion, payment negotiation considerations. Do we pay? Do we not pay? These are things that, when we do these tabletop exercises with organizations, we see these things are often not thought through, right? And making this decision on the spot is typically not a good idea. And then, the only other thing I would add is, from a threat actor perspective and about understanding the threat actors, we're seeing with UNC 3944, or I think more commonly known as Scattered Spider, very aggressive tactics being used against organizations and individuals within those organizations and their families, right? Consider that as part of your plan and how you're going to respond from an overall readiness perspective.
Right. Thanks so much, Jesse. So I think the message coming out very clearly from all of you is you have to be really thinking through all the possible scenarios in advance and how you're going to respond to those in advance. Don't wait until you have to do that thinking in real time. And interesting what you said there about securing the perimeters. I think we might come on in the conversation around systems and maybe old systems, legacy systems. To what extent is that part of an issue here, and to what extent the kind of funding decisions around those also being taken into account? So lots of issues that we can explore. I do have a couple of other questions myself, but we've got some more coming in from the audience. So we've got one from Andy Coulthard. I think our audience is almost entirely Canadian, but I suspect Andy might actually be based in the UK. Andy can correct me if I'm wrong, but Andy has said, do you think public sector organisations understand the difference between disaster recovery and business continuity? There have been some recent cyber incidents causing extended outage and loss of essential business systems like Jaguar Land Rover, which is happening here in the UK. So who would like to come in on that one? Do you think public sector organisations understand the difference between disaster recovery and business continuity? Does anybody want to come in on Andy's question there? We've got silence.
I can,
maybe that's
I can give it
Eric.
a
I'm going
try.
to come to you, Eric. Let's come over.
I would say it depends on the organization. But I mean, at least in the Canadian public sector, business continuity planning is part of the policy on government security, which is a kind of mandated policy. And so, the one of the important links between disaster recovery and business continuity is the business impact assessment. So kind of understanding, the criticality of certain business processes, right? So those are, so the business impact assessment, sometimes it turns into a list of all the different systems that you have, but really the idea is a stewardship and an assessment of business processes, right? So it's that transition from thinking of, uh, um, technology as, kind of an aggregate of different applications or services, and instead thinking them as a business process that's required to support. So I think, I mean, so I think it varies, right? And it's always, one of the questions that's always difficult to answer is, so why in certain cases can they not get the system, and so it's
Yeah.
always, and getting the information as to why it results in those types of extended outages is, it depends on the organization, it depends on the threat, it depends on the response, the quickness of the response, the containment activities, how quickly those are put in place, and also the nature of the systems that are being affected, and what controls those have. So, if you've got an older kind of technology, yeah, it's harder to bring it back up.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
those are a
thanks,
few
Eric.
thoughts that I
I
have.
don't know how much the Jaguar Land Rover issue is being covered in Canada, but essentially the production has stopped in Jaguar Land Rover in the UK because of an ongoing cyber issue. And recently, the government have stepped in to support companies in the supply chain for that issue. So it's been in the news for quite a long time here, quite a big cyber issue at the moment. We've got another question in from Retha, who has said, how important is it to consider cybersecurity? I like this question, as an issue when government funds community-based programs, and how can we prepare communities, external communities? So I really like, I guess the broader nature of this question is, if government is funding programs elsewhere, kind of outside its central control, to what extent should government also be considering cyber issues? And when you say considering, what would that mean? Like, do they provide training to the community initiative, the community program on cyber? What might that look like? Justin, you might do some of this in terms of your guidance. Any thoughts from you?
Yeah, so absolutely. So in terms of like funding communities, a lot of the community funding is actually done at the provincial level or the municipal level. So federal funding is not necessarily there. With that being said, there are some broad initiatives across the government of Canada. For instance, we do have like a grants and contribution program that focuses exclusively on like privacy and security issues. There's also the Digital Citizen Initiative coming out of Heritage Canada, where again, they're targeting like, the broader communities about like, educating the public on some of the risks that are out there. So it's really how that's taking place in terms of like giving training. Through ad hoc guidance, it's being done, but there's no like formal curriculum where like we're saying like everyone sign up for this. Again, like the Cyber Center do have some extraordinary resources for the average person, but how accessible those are, like are they being advertised as well as they should be or could be? That I'm not sure. So I think it's a question also of like that public relation aspect that's sometimes missing too often. I know from like the privacy commissioner perspective, like our commissioners often on the news to talk about privacy issues, to raise awareness and to point them to some of our resources. But again, I think as a government, we could be doing a lot more.
Thanks, Justin. And I've got a kind of relate. Did anyone else want to come in on Rita's question? Alicia or Jesse, Eric? If anyone else wanted to come in on Rita's question itself, but so if not, I've got a kind of related question, I guess, which is my question I was going to ask all of you is, when we're looking at kind of government systems overall, and you mentioned, Jesse, looking at kind of how secure those systems are, where your vulnerabilities are. How does government ensure that the people that it partners with, that the kind of suppliers that it uses, that they themselves are also following best practice when it comes to cyber and good cyber practices?
Yeah, great question. I can jump in here really quick. I think that, you know, third-party vendor management is a topical area that has been part of even before cybersecurity was called cybersecurity, back when it was called information security, was one of those core domains, right? I think it's matured a little bit. I think we've seen a lot of supply chain compromises over the past few years, which are, you know, in a way really bypassing those strong perimeter defenses that some organizations have built, and getting right inside the environment and exploiting from within, right? And that's really the risk there. You know, we've seen this year notable attacks involving public code repositories, third-party libraries, SaaS solutions, 0 days against public cloud providers. So I think, you know, to answer your question, I think it's important to include cybersecurity requirements within third-party vendor management programs, establish checks and balances if they're not, if you don't have them. Make sure contractual obligations are well reviewed by your GRC teams, and that cybersecurity is part of that conversation, right? We want to make sure that we have the right to audit. We want to make sure that breach notification is in place, so that if those third-party vendors do get breached, we know about it, right? You know, enhanced monitoring for critical segments of your network that you know, those third-party vendors might use to perform certain activities within your environment. Having a strong vulnerability management program is critical, including patching, making sure that we're detecting anomalies, and network segmentation. Again, one of those, not a new topic, but I think is even now that we talk about a lot of the move to the cloud, is really kind of still at the forefront, right? And use of multi-factor authentication for vendors is absolutely critical.
Thanks, Jesse. Alicia, Justin, did you want to add anything on that? Yeah, Alicia, coming to you.
Yeah, so the other part that I wanted to add here was really focused on the incident response process, right? Your vendors are an extension of your organization. So how do you actually know to get in contact with them during an incident? What would that look like? And then if you had to get them involved, especially if we're thinking of cloud solutions, what type of assurances can they provide you? What type of audit logs or access logs can they provide you, right? How would they be able to support with that? And we've definitely seen some traction with that, but more often than not, we're still doing tabletop exercises, public, private alike, where it's, oh yes, we have this vendor, we're not entirely sure all the time where we go, or we know that we have this point of contact, but we don't know contractually how quickly they get back to us, or even how they'd be able to support. So that's always critical to say, okay, well, how are they able to align with the best practices in alignment with incident response, but also with our expectations, to make sure that if there was something that happened, we would be able to actually reach out to them and be able to respond adequately and get their support. And then the other bit that's always important is to say, okay, well, if something did happen, where do these connections lie, right? How can we actually cut some of these connections if we had to? You know, where are they integrated? Do they have persistent accounts? Is there some sort of VPN type connection? Like, how are they actually in our environment, both at a human level and at a system level? And we've seen that with some recent attacks lately, where there's, okay, we know this third party's compromised. We don't know what's currently going on there. Let's sever that connection before, you know, they potentially get into our environment. But if you're not aware of that, then you're not able to do so, especially in a timely manner.
Thanks, Alicia. Justin, did you want to add anything there on the?
Yes, I'll add another dimension. So, you know, we've talked about, you know, like the supply chain integrity, how, you know, how companies are responding to breaches, all focus more on what the companies actually do, and that's create and innovate new products. So it's no secret that, you know, privacy and security, they usually go hand in hand. And, you know, at the IPC, we want to encourage companies, like, you know, small businesses, to have privacy by design when they're coming up with new products, new innovations. We actually have an advisory function within the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, where we will help businesses make sure that they integrate privacy as they're developing their products, instead of waiting till the end and then they're like, oh no, we should have thought of X, Y, and Z. Start from the beginning, and that actually can be a differentiator for like new products that are coming out. Say like, no, we thought of your privacy and your security as we're designing the product. So that could be an advantage things for companies. So all I'm saying is like, reach out. It's a free, no strings attached service. You can contact me directly. I'll put you in touch with the right team. So I just wanted to add that dimension.
Thanks, Justin. And I've just noticed Andy has come back and said, yes, he is based in the UK, but previously worked in higher education in Montreal. So has a kind of perspective from both countries there. Please do keep your questions coming in to the audience. But I just wanted to come back on a couple of things that you all said in those opening kind of remarks that you made there. And one of the things, Jesse, that you touched on was learning from the private sector, maybe in terms of their use of AI, for example, in how they are preparing for and addressing some of the challenges. And I just wondered if all of you, but I'll come to you first, Jesse, might say a little bit more about the way AI is maybe changing this issue. So is it changing the nature of the threat, as well as maybe providing the public sector with new tools to address some of those threats?
Yeah, I think both, right? I think, you know, from a defender's perspective, you know, one thing we've talked about quite a bit already is the skills gap. I think this was mentioned by some of the panelists. What AI is enabling is some of the, you know, more junior SOC analysts, for example, the people that we're hiring into our teams to defend against these threats. It's giving them the ability to, you know, query their technologies in real time through natural language on a particular threat that they might be concerned about within the environment and hunt for that threat actively within their environment, right? So a lot of the new technologies that are coming out have AI baked into them, which is really helping, you know, from a defender's advantage perspective, you know, the ability for us to understand those threat actors and if they're already operating within our environment. I think from an external perspective, from an AI threat perspective, we are, you know, through a lot of the investigations that we look at, we are seeing that threat actors are using AI to, you know, craft attack scripts, you know, do a lot of OSINT, so open source intelligence on the targets that they're going after and using AI to normalize a lot of that data, very much like we do in our day-to-day businesses, and how we're using it from a business perspective is how we see the threat actors using it. So I think there's a lot of positives that are coming out of AI in terms of how we leverage it from a defender's perspective, but we have to continue to evolve those practices as the technology matures.
Thanks, Jesse. Eric or Justin, did either of you want to come back in on kind of how new technologies are changing things, either in the threats that you're seeing or in the way that you are preparing for incidents? Eric, come to you.
Yeah, I would say, you know, to me, it's all about the power of the frameworks. And the reason why I say that is because there's so many attack vectors. There's so many attack vectors, and there's so many things that's changing. Like, you know, so we talked about, you know, contracting, right? You know, so these are kind of like insiders, kind of in a way, you know, like let's say they're service providers, they're inside your organization, maybe they're software vendors. You know, we're talking about insurance, we're talking about social engineering. So, you know, in each of these domains, these technologies are evolving and changing and adapting. And of course, AI, you know, is absolutely having a hand in that. You know, both on the attacker side, but also on the response side. So to me, you know, it's like I always kind of come back to, you know, if you take kind of like a multifaceted approach, and then that approach is kind of focused on, you know, the most important vulnerabilities, and your most important assets, whether they be kind of information assets or kind of network style software or hardware assets, is kind of the way to go. And then, you know, if you kind of have that kind of more narrow problem set, then it's you're more easily able to kind of adapt to, you know, the evolving landscape. So yeah, so for me, that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Anyone else want to come in on new technologies or AI before we move on? So the next question that I had when we were going through those initial responses is we did touch on kind of systems as well, and I wanted to come back to legacy systems. So to what extent, I think one of the challenges may be that the public sector, I might be wrong here, but the public sector might have more than the private sector, is public sector still has a lot of old legacy systems which maybe aren't as secure as we would like them to be. So I just wondered whether this, Justin, you want to come in here, but to what extent is this a big issue? And also, is there a vulnerability as you transition to a new system, moving over your data? Does that in itself create new vulnerabilities as you move to new systems?
So before being at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, I was actually at Shared Services Canada. So for those that are not familiar, Shared Services Canada is pretty much like the big IT provider for the government of Canada. So legacy is definitely an issue. And one of the challenges that we're seeing is that departments don't necessarily have an incentive to move away from their legacy systems. We can say like, do it, it's going to be better, but like changing their entire stack, modernizing those programs that are running on that legacy infrastructure is costly, and there's not a lot of appetite to do that. There's also the small departments and agencies that are not necessarily mandated to use all the latest and greatest that SSC is offering. And that's also a challenge. I know in budget, I believe it's 2022, there was some funding allocated for small departments and agencies to consume some of SSC's products, but it's not the entire suite. So again, like those legacy systems are still running on really like those small pocket departments that are like, it's pretty much like the person who's the CIO, who's also like your database administrator, who's also, your CFO, right? So it's like that one person doing a lot of roles, and like securing all that legacy infrastructure is a challenge. So how do we move past that? I think it comes down really to the center, like so Treasury Board, PCO, and finance working and creating incentives for like those departments to move away from their legacy infrastructure into the enterprise data centers.
Thanks, Justin. Anybody else want to come in? Jesse and Alicia, I don't know if you've been working with organizations to the extent to which the systems themselves, rather than maybe cultural issues, the extent to which the systems might be an issue.
Yeah, I would say in my experience, legacy is a big issue across the board. Yes, in public sector, yes, in private sector. And I think there's also those considerations to say, okay, well, how do we protect that? And we know that. And obviously migration into something that's more secure, something that can be patched, that's always the recommended approach, right? We want to say, yes, let's move towards systems that are more secure. But obviously that takes time, that takes effort, that needs budget, that needs resources. And there's also the consideration for service downtime, right? We can't just move everything even if we wanted to tomorrow. There has to be a plan to make sure that we're still providing services on a regular basis. So those considerations for, okay, well, this is very critical. This is sensitive data. How do we limit? So like what part of that legacy system do we actually still need? What can we move that's a little bit easier in the peripheral to something that's more secure, right? Do all these components have to keep running on legacy systems? And then for those that do, how do we best protect that? So something like, for example, we've done some threat modeling work to say, okay, well, what does that actually look like? What are those key components? How do we enhance those countermeasures for those specific key components, especially those that are legacy? How do we really reduce the blast radius as much as possible? And so this is something to say, yes, it happens. There are ways to mitigate against it in the process while you're trying to move toward a more secure and modern environment.
Thanks, Alicia. Another question I wanted to come back, and this was something, Alicia, that you actually said when you mentioned in the beginning, you were saying how desirable it would be for people who aren't necessarily specialists to have training, so to understand some of these issues themselves, so regardless of which profession they sit in. And I was just wondering, this is a question to all of you, whether you still get frustrated by officials just not doing some of the basics when it comes to good cyber hygiene. Are there things that you regularly see which really shouldn't be still issues when it comes to people's day-to-day cyber hygiene? And I wondered if maybe that's been affected by hybrid working. Are people less secure working at home? I don't know if that's an issue or not, but are there kind of things that you see that just frustrate you that shouldn't be an issue anymore? Jesse, I will start with you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, security awareness across the board is something that it continues to evolve. I think, going back to the AI discussion and around the attacker's perspective here, we're seeing a lot of AI deepfakes, voice cloning, it's getting pretty advanced, right? Some of the very advanced models now are able to generate very visuals of ourselves, use our voices, and with a little bit of intelligence gathering, you know, it's pretty easy to trick people and service desks to give passwords or to enable access for a threat actor into an environment. So I think when you talk about, you know, frustrations, I think yes, there are some things that we continue to see, like you know, shared passwords being used across multiple services, right? So okay, I'm going to make my work password the same as my Facebook password and the same as my bank password. You know, those are things that I think most of us should know now are bad practice, but still continually happens, right? And then I think there's some of those new things that I mentioned around deepfakes that you know, I think we're catching up on, and we're realizing that are new challenges, and we're getting ahead of them, and that's, you know, an evolving area, right?
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Eric, coming to you, anything that you think you see regularly that you wish you didn't still see?
Well, the journey of security is ongoing, is an ongoing activity, and it's a long-term activity. And, you know, so, you know, in many situations, you'll find, you know, different questions around legacy or individual practices and these sorts of things. So it's really kind of like an ongoing full court press, you know, in all of these areas. And I think most people in IT, you know, were surprised by very little in terms of how, you know, end users interact with systems and the state of systems, right? So I think, you know, it's incumbent upon us to, you know, see ourselves as really the agents of change, you know, to be able to kind of bring this to organizations. You know, awareness and training is a big piece. You know, business cases for modernization, the importance of security, but not, you know, over dramatizing, right? So that people say, oh, you know, it's never going to happen to us or whatever. You know, so all these things, you know, were kind of like a daily journey to kind of move the needle forward in all the kind of different dimensions that we would do. So I would turn it, you know, less about frustration, and I would say more about, you know, kind of developing a patience and a long view. Um, in the government of Canada, we've got an approach to security planning, which is a 3-year security planning cycle with a re-up every year. You know, and so I think this is a good kind of time horizon to think about. You know, you need to think about it in the long haul, because, you know, system modernization takes a long time, right? It takes a long time. But there's also, you know, having a yearly re-up of your 3-year plan allows you to kind of adjust for new or changing threat vectors or guidance, and also allows you to kind of achieve things that are possible to achieve within a shorter time window. So that's how
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, thanks. That was a very diplomatic answer. I could feel some of your pain there on not being surprised by end users. I think a few years of experience there you have. Justin and Alicia, did you want to add anything on kind of things that you see happening that you wish didn't happen anymore?
Yes. Oh, sorry, Alicia, do you want to go first?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I had mentioned at the beginning, right? So, you know, as the OPC, we see like breach reporting happen on a daily basis, right? We see like the nature of the breach, what could have been done to prevent those breaches. And I would say like the top 2 things, the most annoying things, the lack of multi-factor authentication and credential stuffing, credential reuse, like those are like 2 pet peeves. I swear if those had been mitigated or like implemented properly, 90% of the breaches would not have happened, or they would have been so much tougher to have been perpetrated. So those are the 2 things that, you know, on a daily basis, I wish would not be happening or properly implemented.
Thanks, Justin. Alicia.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, fundamentally, when you look at it from a breach perspective, a lot of the breaches that actually happen really prey on people's trust, right? Trying to impersonate a user, trying to convince somebody to do something. And I think the frustration is actually the innate use of people trying to prey on that human goodness or whatever you want to call it, right? That vulnerability to say, hey, like, I trust you, therefore you should do this action. So I think there's a balance in trying to train users across the board to be, let's say, healthily suspicious, right? Like trust but verify. How do you understand that happens? But then trying to turn those frustrations into how do we actually enable our users to make this easier? So for example, if I send you something and you're not sure it's me, you can totally reach out and verify via chat or some other means, hey, did you send me this? attacks. And that extra couple of minutes there shouldn't be viewed as a point of friction or frustration, but more of a, hey, thank you for doing that. That is something that we appreciate in the culture of our organization. Or things such as looking at, okay, well, how do we build in good security practices? We don't like it when people reuse passwords. Okay, well, have we looked at password managers and enabling people and training them how to use that and encouraging that practice, both in, you know, their professional lives, but also in their personal lives? Because a lot of this really comes down to how are we sort of taking advantage of that human framework, and then to say, okay, well, we're all people. So what are those controls that we can put in place to still make it feel like we're still treating this like we are still people, but also putting in those controls to reduce the ability for threat actors to take advantage of that.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. And that's a nice segue. Just to the audience, we've got a few minutes left. So if you do have any questions, please send them in now. But I wanted to pick up on trust and the issue of trust, because I think Andy there in the comment mentioned the issue with Jaguar Land Rover, but actually, you will all have examples from across Canada, from different countries, of breaches that have affected the public. So, we have had in the UK, for example, we have had big cyber issues in hospitals, trusts, where data has been stolen. We have had issues at airports still going on across Europe at the moment, which have affected people's travel, for example. To what extent can the government actually maintain the trust of the public, do you think, when it comes to the extent to which they are able to deal with some of these cyber attacks? But also, how should they be dealing with those moments when it comes to communicating with the public? How transparent should they be about some of the issues that are happening? Justin, you're nodding there. I will come to you. So, the importance of trust, I think, around cyber issues.
So I think part of the answer was actually in the way you formulated the question. Transparency is key. So, the question of like, when do you notify the public? It's a good question because at the same time, you're trying to, pretty much like contain the breach. So do you want to tip off the threat actor at the same time where you're telling everyone, it's like, by the way, we were hacked. So it's a difficult balance. With that having been said, I think once the breach is has been contained and you start doing your post-mortem, I think communicate what we learned, how as an organization, we can improve and how we've improved. I think that's part of also maintaining the trust with the public. Also, giving updates, in the last year, for instance, we implemented these additional security features. For instance, your CRA account, now you have to do multi-factor authentication. So talking about some of those security enhancements that you made helps also improve the trust of the public.
And also, it fascinates me sometimes how we only hear about the breaches that occur. We don't hear about all of the issues that have been stopped. But I don't know if telling the public how big this issue is behind the scenes would actually help or make it worse. I'm not sure.
It's a difficult balance because you also don't want to necessarily tip all the safeguards that you've put in place. That way the threat actor can adapt and bypass those. So again, it's a difficult balance.
Yeah, thanks. Eric, you're smiling there. In terms of how transparent do we need to be with the public to maintain their trust on these issues?
Yeah, I would say trust is earned. Absolutely. Right. So, and it's earned, in the controls that we put in place to kind of prevent the activities, but then, specific ways in which we communicate with folks when those events do occur. So Justin, he's from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. There's actually a very kind of structured process for how we need to communicate with individuals whose privacy has been affected by some kind of compromise. So I think this is a really good practice of trust building, that is kind of mandated for government institutions. So yeah, and I think you definitely want to be as transparent as you can. Balancing the risks of over transparency, right? And those risks of over transparency can be saying things that don't end up being the case, right? So in many situations, you're kind of in a cyber event, and you're not exactly sure what's happening or the impacts and these sorts of things. So it's important to share, in a way that provides awareness and builds confidence, but not in a way that then you have to kind of backtrack and say, oh, it actually was this, or it actually wasn't even, we actually didn't even have an event. It was something else. Yeah, so I would say it's a diligent process, and I think it goes back to kind of our incident planning where, if you have a kind of a crisis communications plan and then everyone is on the same page as to the types of messages, like we have templates that we provide ahead of time, for different scenarios, so we know exactly what would be said in exactly what scenario. And I think this is important because just like in any kind of incident response, if you want to maintain trust, you have to have a good communications plan. And I think developing a communications plan when you're in a cyber event is not advised. It's not advised.
Yeah.
It's much stronger to have that
In
communications
place.
plan in place
Yeah.
ahead of time, so that you can kind of build the trust and the confidence through the process, if there is an event.
Thanks, Eric. And Jesse and Alicia, I guess I'm interested in your perspective. Do you think it's even more important for the public sector to be transparent about these kind of issues than it is for the private sector? Is it harder for them to kind of maintain the public's trust, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the public sector has a duty to be transparent about these things, right? I mean, ultimately, we're looking to our government to help drive our strategies forward, and private sector is absolutely taking those factors into consideration. The CCCS releases the National Cyber Threat Assessment annually, which talks about Canada's threat landscape and how that's changing. And I think that alone helps build trust, right? I think, again, we're looking to the government to some degree to help us understand the type of threats we're seeing at the state level, the national level, right? I do want to echo some of the things that Eric said around communications plan, and we see this quite a bit, right? When we're helping respond to ransomware incidents. It's when you're in an incident, how you communicate, whether it's to your own internal employees or whether it's to third-party vendors or the public, how you do that is critical, right? You don't want to necessarily give away to the threat actors that you're taking certain actions that could potentially put at risk, private information or challenge the ransomware negotiations that you might be actively taking place in, right? You also don't want to tip attackers off, allowing them to change the way that they're operating within your environment if you communicate too early and let them know that, hey, we've engaged law enforcement, we've done all these other actions, we've got a third-party incident responder working with us. In some cases, that makes things a lot worse. So how we communicate, very important in incident response activities.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. Alicia, any final thoughts on the importance of transparency and gaining trust?
One of the things I wanted to highlight is actually the increase in public-private partnerships, and we're seeing more sector-wide committees in the private sector that's actually involving members of the public sector. And I think that's gone a long way. I know it's not evident to all members of the public, but for those involved to say, here's how we can help, here's sort of the venues you can go through. At the same time, here's how we would share that information. We've talked a lot about communications during this webinar. Communications during an incident are even tougher, not just knowing who, but how I can share, what I can share, right? And that depends on each organization. So establishing these vehicles of communication in advance and talking through some of the, well, I'm not sure we can share those, and we take that back. Let's establish these relationships where we have these trust partnerships helps, because in an incident that provides a vehicle for additional transparency, but also another lever to use during your response.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alicia. And we've just got time for one last question that has come in from John Simpson. And I think this was probably in response to something that you said, Jesse, in one of your answers is, do you think an app or a security platform will be developed that will alert users that they are viewing or using an advanced deepfake or AI generated construct or scam? I like this question. So any thoughts from any of you on, do you think it will be we'll come up with something that will, I think this already has started to exist, but will we know if we're looking at something that is deep fake or AI generated? Justin, is there any guidance on this at the moment where you have to say that you're producing something that's AI generated?
Not to my knowledge. I believe the EU is moving towards that, but for
Okay.
Canada, we're not there yet. There's
Okay.
obviously some interest, but I know there's been some codes of practices where like some organizations have said, like, if you are creating a deep fake, you have to say it's a deep fake on our
Yeah.
platform. But that, I think, is more organizations volunteering than
Okay.
being like codified into law.
Yeah,
With
thanks.
that having been said, there's also law reform that will probably take place again with the new parliament. So we may be looking at that. We have like the Minister of AI and Digital Innovation that just got created. So they may be looking at codifying that into law. We'll see.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you're right. I think the EU are talking about this, but I guess if you're generating a deep fake for, illegal purposes, you're not necessarily going to follow
Exactly.
the guidance on that, are you? Anybody else want to come back on, John? Any thoughts on, do you think it will be possible to identify, will there be an app or something that can identify deep fake or AI generated content? Any final thoughts on John's question? Jeffrey?
Yeah, I can add something here. I think there is a responsibility on content providers as well to flag when something is potentially a deep fake that someone is watching that's hosted on their services, right? YouTube being an example of that. I think tools that can detect deep fakes within calls like we're having right now within Zoom do already exist.
Right.
They're essentially bots that kind of listen into the conversation, and if they detect that there is someone that could potentially be a threat actor that is leveraging deep fakes to participate in the call or listen in, they flag that person and boot them out, right? So we're starting to see a lot of innovation in that space, but definitely more work to do.
Thanks. So I guess for John, it's a watch this space. It might be coming, watch this space. Thank you so much. I think we are out of time. That was our last round of questions. I just want to say a huge thank you to Jesse, to Alicia, to Eric, and to Justin. A really fascinating conversation there. I think it just shows how much work is being done in terms of understanding the nature and the scale of the threats, but that this is always changing. I mean, constantly changing. So I think, as you say, Eric, understanding the guidelines rather than trying to understand all the individual different players in this is probably a good place to start. Thank you, Justin. I've seen you shared some information with the audience. Just to say to the audience, thank you so much for all of your questions. We will have sent you a very short questionnaire. If you could take a couple of minutes to fill in that questionnaire, it'd be very helpful for us because it will just mean we continue to give you webinars on topics that are of most value and most interest to you. We will also be sharing with everybody who joined live, but everybody who registered and wasn't able to join live as well, the link to the recording of this conversation. So you'll be able to watch it again or watch it if you weren't able to, and share it with your colleagues as well if you think there are people who would find this conversation useful. And in a couple of weeks' time, we will also share an article that will have the key kind of issues that came out of today's conversation. So thank you very much to our fantastic panel. Thank you so much to Google Cloud for being our knowledge partner today. Thank you to the audience, and I hope to see you all again on one of our webinars very soon. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye. See you soon.
Thank you.